Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. I am the director of Freed Indeed Ministries, Kevin Hughes, and today we have our first episode where I will have an official co-host, Mr. Matthew Emmerson, the senior writer of the blog Vespers in Vienna, which if you haven't checked it out yet, you should because you're missing out. It's excellent.
I
Um,
appreciate that.
and so I hope everybody is staying safe right now. Hope everybody's practicing their social distancing, surviving our little mini black plague.
Otherwise called an introvert's dream.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Hope everybody's living the introvert dream right now. I've seen so many jokes about people being gamers and how, everybody used to tease me for being a gamer. Well, who's laughing now?
I mean, this is just my normal lifestyle. As one who peruses the gaming medium from time to time. This is day to day.
Right. So I do hope everybody's staying safe, and I hope that we can be a small blessing to you here. I do apologize that we weren't able to have our episode, I believe it was last week, with Caleb about monarchy. And for any of you out there who know Caleb, he's a good friend of mine, and we are praying for him. He's in a really difficult situation, the coronavirus. He hasn't gotten it himself, but for various reasons, it has affected his work very much, and it's put him in a very stressful situation. So, utmost understanding to our brother Caleb there. And without further ado, today Matthew and I are going to be discussing the identity crisis of the West. So, to give us a little bit of background with that, the concept of the identity crisis of the West was brought up by Robert Cartinal Sarah, or however you pronounce his name.
I say Sarah, but that's fine.
Sarah, Robert Cardinal Sarah, in his book, the name of which actually I had it just a second ago, but it escapes me now.
Was this the
Um,
power of silence, or is this a different one? The day is now far
the
spent.
new one, the new one.
Is it the day is now far spent?
Yep, that one. Thank
Yeah.
you. See, this is why I need a co-host.
just to check your memory.
Exactly. So the day is now, so he brings this up in The Day Is Now Far Spent about how for a very long time, the Western world had a consistent identity. And well, obviously, we never had a utopian society. We still had wars. We still weren't always consistent with that identity. And our identity was really centered around the church. But nevertheless, we had that unifying identity that really brought us together and made us have an ability to really cohesively work as a society. To a greater or lesser extent, we've lost that. And we can see that as that identity has fallen by the wayside, the West has really gone into an identity crisis and collapsed to where people don't know what gender they are, to where people don't know their own history. And it's all symptomatic of this identity crisis that we forsake our history, we forsake our unifying Christian faith, and we really just fall into this every man for himself individualism, and we can't even figure out who or what we are anymore. So that is the discussion on the table. Matthew, do you have any initial thoughts on Robert Cardinal Sarah's reflection there?
I wish I could say I've read it myself, but like every bad Catholic, I barely read. That's only half a joke. But no, I think that this identity crisis is something that affects us systemically. I think this is the right use of the word. In that we kind of see this on basically every level of society. Um, this is actually something my friend and I really, I'll give him all the praise for it. But one of my other hats is I'm a creative director for a blog called chapteroftheday.com, and it's all about living your life through, exploring your life through storytelling. And one of our major goals of this kind of exercise, or what my buddy is going for in founding this blog, is like figuring out who you are and what kind of character you are in your own story. I've written a couple pieces like this, called "Act Like You're Just a Side Character" is one of my writings on it, and "Treat Yourself Like You're the Main Character" is my other. I wrote 2 companion pieces on this, and I think this all plays into our big identity crisis. So that is the identity crisis on the small scale. Each individual person has kind of no idea who they are in this big cosmic story, because, as we've spoken about previously, once you cast God out the window, not only do you lose meaning or anything, but you lose identity. And that's something I'm going to put my pin in before we go back to. And then it just kind of, whenever each individual cell isn't working, of course, like the microorganism, the organism, and then as it kind of keeps going further and further out, continues to fail. If cells stop working, then organs stop working, then the body stops working. And so, but the problem is, I think with the identity crisis in the West, is it is both a top-down identity crisis and a bottom-up identity crisis that is just met in the middle and is now like doomed us, essentially. Not to sound overly pessimistic, but I think he's right. And you could point, I mean, take your pick on where you want to mark this identity problem. If you were to ask me privately on a YouTube channel that can be watched by anybody, but I would probably say that this began at the death of Christendom, and you could mark the death of Christendom at 2 different periods of time, I think, and you'd probably be right. You can mark it at the death of Catholic France. So the end of the French Revolution, beginning in the Napoleonic era, you could say is the death of Christendom. I've heard several people mark it there, which is like the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, the beginning of the French Republic, that era. You could also mark the death of Christendom at, I don't know, 1517. And so where you have the shattering of a united, and I know tons of postmodernists are going to sweat over this, you have the shattering of a united church-controlled Europe. Because now you don't have a central episcopacy running to the top that's able to check every single country in existence, and every single country bending the knee, not that this happened perfectly in the ideal, bending the knee to the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire as the first among equals of Catholic monarchs. Now that you have an entire block of Protestant states in the north of the Holy Roman Empire, you have all of Protestant Scandinavia, you have Protestant England and Scotland. So you have the initial shattering of Christendom there, where we at least have basically the same moral values, even though we'll disagree over like ecclesiology and stuff like that. But then you have like the true, in my opinion, death knell of Christendom, with classical liberalism coming in, shattering Europe, killing Catholic France, killing the Holy Roman Empire, and just the beginning of the revolutionary 1800s. So I think both eras are to blame, and that's not just me being an annoying papist, but like I think both eras broke something in the mind of an individual citizen.
I agree. To a certain extent, I would say that I would agree with you, and I would even say, as far as an interesting point that Richard M. Weaver brings up about these sorts of things is, he says it's true that when our society was what you were just describing, a society that had to at least bend the knee more or less to the ideal of Christianity, even if most of Europe perhaps wasn't living up to their Christian ideals, they had to bend the knee to the ideal, and the ideal itself was actually helpful. Once we chuck the ideal, we no longer have these concepts like chivalry and the ecclesiastical discipline, the polity of every nation under a central church authority.
The rhythm of Christian life for an
Right,
everyday peasant,
exactly.
of
Exactly.
regular confession, church on Sunday, taking rests on
Right.
high feast days. We lose, and each expression. This is a myth I've done my best to try and expel as much as I can. Of like, while everyone was unified under central Roman Catholicism, a typical peasant in the middle of England didn't give a damn what the Pope had to say. And
Right.
nor did the Pope care what an average English peasant was doing. He was too busy with central Italian politics.
Right, exactly.
But like, each grouping of Christendom still had its own expressions of Christendom that made you an English Catholic or a French Catholic or a
Right.
German Catholic. Like, you had Walsingham in England, and then you had the pilgrimage of St. James of Santiago down in, like, there were these
Exactly.
deeply ethnic identities that were both wrapped up in your people group and your religion. And I want to
Right.
focus on this very quickly, because once you become ethno-centered without your Catholic in the sense of, like, according to the whole Holocaust religion,
Right.
you immediately become a nationalist. You become an ethnic nationalist, because you cannot take pride in your religion without your religion. You cannot take pride in your ethnicity. And let me try and be less hyperbolic. It's very dangerous to become very focused in your ethnicity when you don't have another
Right.
unifying factor outside of it, like your religion. Because that's what happens whenever we all abandon Christianity in the late 1800s, early 1900s. You get Nazis, you get fascist Italy, you get
Right.
communist Russia, where my group better, everyone bad. Let's off the Ukrainians, let's off the Jews, let's off the Gypsies,
Exactly.
let's off the Ethiopians. Like, we'll do whatever we can because my ethnicity is better. So when you abandon the religion that has now unified all populaces, and again, Pope Leo the 13th says that we should treasure ethnic differences as if
Right.
given by God. That's in one of his political treatises of the late 1800s. Once you abandon that and it's just your ethnicity that you're drawing your identity from, that's a very quick and bad slippery slope.
Right.
And so this is, again, an expression of how individually our identity has become lost, confused, and shattered without any kind of overarching Christianity or any kind of unifying doctrine. Because you could fire back, well, just the fact that we're human should mean something.
Right.
To which I would say, well, why does that matter? Like, if humans don't have any extra intrinsic worth that is valuable in of itself, and you cannot make
Right.
that a matter of fact. Like, you can't just go, oh, you're valuable for being human because you're human. Why? Like, that
Right.
doesn't make any sense. You have to go through the logic. If we live in this godless universe of nothing mattering, it's very hard to start arguing intrinsic worth for things. It's very difficult to. I don't know if it's logically possible. I don't outright ban it, but I have not seen it done properly for me. And none of the nihilists of the 1800s nor 1900s attempt to do that. None of them say God isn't real, but life still kind of like has intrinsic worth.
Right.
The reason they freak out so much is because they can't figure out a reason for life to have worth. And so once you cast out Christianity as your fundamental value for your identity, that you're a beloved son of God who has dignity, has the imago Dei inside of you, which provides you some level of worth, no matter what you are. Like, that's the key difference. And don't necessarily quote me on this, but I think this is half accurate. Even the reason American, meaning like, 1800s Southern slavery, it was so messed up is because previously, even the tone of slavery switched in the Roman Empire post-Christianization. So yes, the church didn't immediately ban slavery, and we can talk about whether or not that was right or wrong.
Right.
But like, the ancient Greeks literally said slaves had different types of souls. Like, that was just in their essence was to be slaves.
Right.
Christianity comes along and says, slaves are just as an equal dignity of you and should be treated as such. And
Right.
so while we didn't perfectly abolish slavery, I truly think the church was working to do so and eventually
Right.
did into
Exactly.
serfdom. It brought about the feudal era, which was different, and brought about a contractual obligation between feudal lord and peasant. And that's what made Southern style slavery so perverse in the
Right.
1800s. It was
Exactly.
basically a return to pagan slavery of these class
Exactly.
of people
Which
aren't
then
humans
required a
and don't have
racist.
intrinsic dignity.
Right.
Sorry, that was a
Exactly. Which,
long-winded rant, but
no, it's fine. It's fine. You're spot on. So Southern slavery, the reason why it required sort of this racist thing was actually because it was a return to Roman pagan style slavery in which your slaves are not considered equally human. And since we had abandoned that for Christian reasons, they had to come up with some way to justify it, which is why Darwinism ended up having such an appeal. That's kind of the dirty history that they don't want to talk about in public schools.
read
But
read The Great Gatsby. That's like one
right.
of the
Oh
like
yeah.
the one character's like explaining how different skulls prove that like white people are better. And like
Exactly.
obviously F. Scott Fitzgerald's trying to draw the absurdity of that idea, like to it. He's like embodying it in that character. And which is why racism is perverse, a heresy, and probably a sin.
Exactly.
Like I would go so far to say in Christianity, because that's just there is neither Jew nor Greek nor free nor
Exactly.
slave nor man nor woman. Like that is against the gospel tidings of St.
It
Paul.
is.
And so,
It is.
but again,
Well,
this all
and
goes
Paul
back to a
even goes
crisis
as
of
far,
identity.
and Paul even goes as far as he doesn't say to Philemon, you need to just let Onesiphorus go and not be a slave anymore, but he does say to Philemon, you need to treat Onesiphorus as a brother. So
Mm-hmm.
he's, in some sense, the epistle to Philemon is actually pretty radical as far as how it will set the stage for abolitionism in a much more true sense, I think, than what we have today. Because today we have abolitionism, and I'm going to make probably what's going to be a very controversial statement, but we have a faux abolitionism today where we've abolished slavery, but at the same time, we still let, Pornhub have 15-year-old girls getting human trafficked and raped, and everybody, well, not everybody, because I'm not turning a blind eye right now, but the vast majority of society just turns a blind eye and says, I don't see it, I don't really care. We don't call that slavery. We put nice words on it. We call it maybe prostitution or human trafficking, but we're
Or
not
sex
honest
work.
with our
Just sex.
right.
Just sex work.
Right. It's just sex work. We're not honest with ourselves enough to say that we haven't really abolished slavery. Whereas in the medieval times, and people can argue back and forth about whether or not this society was perfect. I don't think we'll ever have a perfect society, but what was nice is what you just pointed out. In feudal Europe, people were not slaves, they were serfs, and that serfdom, that peasant class, was actually seen as the backbone of society. They were not seen as just peons that you could work to death and then whatever. They had certain protections in place, not the least of which was because if I'm a feudal lord and I have all these peasants, in a grand sense, I need these people to keep me safe from this other feudal lord whose fiefdom is 20 miles to the south, who, if he's able to rally his peasants, he could come and kill me and take over my fiefdom. So I need these peasants. And so I have a vested interest not only in them being to a certain degree happy, but in them having enough of a reasonably good life, enough of a reasonably pious life that we're working together and there's these contractual obligations. It's not just I'm a better person than you, so you're under my feet. like really any other society that has ever existed.
Yeah,
And
we try to, I think virtue signals the word, like, again, not saying the feudal era was perfect or anything like
right,
that, but modern media has really painted like, bad king, now free in democracy. Do you really
right.
think that late stage capitalism is much more free than like the feudal era? I don't
Well,
think
I've
so.
argued
Like,
that it's much less
yeah,
free.
no, I mean, we have less days off and like all of this stuff, and like we're all like so depressed and anxious and suicidal.
Right,
Like, we're not that better off. Like, I was talking with a friend the other day, and I said to him, I go, we have no record of any, crippling mass suicides from
right,
the feudal era because people's lives were meaningless because they weren't able to go and travel and find themselves in the Grand Canyon. Like,
right,
that just does. They didn't care, but they were fine. Like, they got by, and again, wasn't always perfect, and there were periods of starvation, and they didn't have penicillin. And like, I get
right.
that, but to act like late stage capital, like this is one thing where I'm going to sound like a communist for 5 seconds, but like, you think late stage capitalism has freed us much? Oh my gosh, like we are slaves to the oligarchs
Right,
and big business. Like, no, 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 no. Like, we are nowhere about, we don't even have a contractual obligation with
exactly.
anyone to take care of us because we are the sovereign individual and like it's
Right,
just on us now. But
right,
what does that
exactly.
individual even mean? Why do I have any self-worth in a godless universe and in a government that does not want to pay any credence to a higher power, which means
Right,
it has no obligation to recognize any of your rights? Like,
exactly.
what's life? Like, who are you? You're like, and this is where I think a lot of the existential anxiety comes from. This is something that I think a lot of that breed of psychologists gets very deeply. And I think this is why, going back to our self-esteem talk, why all these psychologists are so obsessed with self-actualization. What does that
Exactly.
mean other than finding out who you actually are? Because I think that's what we're all trying to figure out. Who
I
am
agree.
I? And so we have this existential angst and existential anxiety because we're all these amorphous blobs who are supposed to exist. I don't know if you watched the Fairly Odd Parents when you were a kid, Kevin,
A little
but
bit, yeah.
there was this one episode, and anybody who's around my age or maybe a little bit younger will remember, where I forget what the reason was, but Timmy just like wanted to be the same of everybody, and it was just this gray world where everyone was a blob and there was no self-expression, and like that's kind of it. Like whenever it's all on you to come up with your own identity, you're just kind of this weird morphable blob that has kind of
Exactly.
nothing set in stone because who you need to be whoever you should be at the most advantageous moment of your life. And so or as Carl Jung said, like a human being is a mask for every single person that they know.
Right,
And that's not necessarily unhealthy. Like, I am different on this show than I am when I'm like hanging out with my parents or grabbing a beer with my
right.
friends. But like, whenever there is no actor under the mask and it's just different masks that you're putting on all the time, which is what you're going to do because without God or anything, why is there a reason to have a person under the mask? And so we all become hyper anxious and sad. And to
Right.
make this more on the global scale, to get to the crisis of the West, when every single member of society in the West doesn't know what it means to be a Westerner, or doesn't know what it means to be an American, or doesn't know what it means to be a Pennsylvanian or a Washingtonian. I don't know, or like whatever you Pacific Northwesterners call yourself. But like, whenever none of us know what that means. Heck, whenever we
Right.
don't know what it means to be a Christian because we're so shattered and divided,
Unfortunately.
what are we going to do? Like, what do you have to do with yourself? But like,
Right.
numb yourself.
That gets back to sort of Benjamin Moorfield saying that a word that can mean anything ceases to mean anything.
Mhm.
So, if the word evangelical, for example, if what that means is what it means today, which is literally anything essentially that's
Oh, so
not Catholic.
that could be anything from Joel Osteen to a conservative Southern Baptist.
Right. All of them fall under this umbrella term evangelical. I would argue that that word doesn't mean a darn thing,
Heck,
because
Father James Martin and Cardinal Sarah are
right,
both Catholic.
right.
What does that mean?
That's true. That's very true. That gets back to a certain degree the influx of liberation theology within Roman Catholicism. That I do think that what's his name, Pope John Paul II, did some work to try to correct, but
Yeah.
man, he was not able to fix it entirely. And
No, I mean,
we
South
are
America is just a big ball of theological problems for everybody. And again, that's obviously not racist against South Americans. I'm just speaking of the state of the theological
right,
natures there, because like you have like Pentecostal cults basically developing down there, and then you have liberation theology infecting Roman Catholicism, and you still have kind of like leftover vestiges of paganism and stuff like
right,
infecting any Christian camp and stuff like that. And again, like take this all the way to the macro level, not saying like Christianity good, paganism bad, or anything. Like it's just this weird collection right now. And because of colonialism, like just destroying South America, and like
right.
Bolivar's experiment falling apart. And I have a buddy who like minored in Latin American studies in undergrad, and he was talking to me one day, and I was like, oh my gosh, I just feel bad for every country. And that's not because I'm like, oh, me America good, they're bad. It's just like,
Right,
man, did they have a string of problems, and man, did America make it worse.
right,
Like,
exactly.
man, it's like, you know what? I hear there's a communist down there. Let's go put a fascist in charge. Like that's just like, it was terrible what we
Well,
did to them.
yeah, I mean, it's
Side,
interesting too, because whenever the immigration debate kicks up, I always hear this argument pretty commonly said: why don't these people just fix their own country and stop coming here? Which
why
I
did we
always think,
ruin their country?
right, well, it's so stupid because we're the ones who broke their country, and then we say, why don't you just go fix your own country so that I can break it and exploit it again, probably.
Exactly. That's like so we
And
can like, become a republic at home, empire abroad again. But
exactly.
I think this is why you see the terms of so many like micro groups coming up. Getting back to the identity crisis, because then you have High Church Episcopalian, Anglican Catholic, Traditionalist Catholic, Rad Trad, Left Cats or Left Catholics, ex-evangelicals, evangelicals, conservative evangelical. Like you have because all of these terms don't matter anymore because they've
Right.
become so amorphous, and they don't what they stand for. No, like what they mean on paper is not what they are in practice. And you even
Exactly.
had this back in the day with cradle Catholics versus convert Catholics, I guess, where like the converts took it seriously, but cradles were bad. Or like it just keeps what's the word? Stratifying. Because people keep trying to find camps. Neocons, Tea Party conservatives,
Right.
reactionaries, I'm sure there's more. I don't follow politics that much. I follow enough to be not be illiterate. But anyways, like people keep trying to find camps that represent who they are when they
Right.
barely know who they are because they don't know what to ground their identity is. Like, is your identity
Exactly.
really just your political ideology? Like, is your
Right.
identity really just kind of the genre of music that you're in? And you find people like this all the time. And I'm not insulting them. They don't have anything else to put their identity in, so they have to
Well,
do
we're
something.
not insulting them because, in some sense, I think, and maybe this is kind of a Socrates way of looking at it, I guess. In some sense, I think it's not their fault because we used to, and this goes back to the identity crisis of the West, we used to have a Western identity that we were Christian first and then whatever else we were second. I could be a Christian who also believed in maybe a slightly left leaning economics policy, but I was Christian primarily. And what I meant by left leaning economics policy was that I wanted certain things available to the poor, for
Yeah.
example. And now that worked out really well in, again, going back to a feudalist system, that actually worked out pretty well because if I was an influential person with a feudal lord, I could put some of these things in place and be helping the peasants. Whereas in our ultra free society, it's very difficult to be, especially in a two-party system, to have any sort of influence for maybe certain ideas. Like Andrei Davidov, I know, has had a very difficult time. I realize he's not actually Western, he's Russian, but Andrei Davidov has had a difficult time because on the one hand, he's a monarchist, so very conservative, but on the other hand, he would like to see every single Russian citizen receiving certain benefits from the economic development of Russia, which sounds like almost a communist position. But I actually think he makes some really great arguments for it. But what happens is he ends up getting fired on from both sides because we don't live in the kind of society where you're allowed to be a Christian primarily and then have your other views in submission to that. And so what you do end up with is, without that bedrock foundation, my political identity is my identity. My musical identity is my identity. My love of cats is my identity.
They always have to make an appearance somehow. Say hi, dudes.
So I do think that brings us to sort of the origin of the crisis, which, as we said before, the, if you will, death of Christendom in the West, or the toppling of institutional Christendom in the West, is sort of the birth of this identity crisis. But I would also say that the radical individualism you alluded to before, that starts to arise, really it doesn't start to, but finds one of its chief sort of architects, if you will, one of its chief Trojan horses comes during the Protestant Reformation. And I do think that Protestantism was probably a necessary thing, since there were some serious problems that needed to be addressed. But at the same time, is it really a good thing that you have Martin Luther saying, here, he didn't really say this, but the sentiment is there, here I stand, I can do no other. I'm here with my conscience as Martin Luther, and I have to stand against the whole church because you can't come up with a proof text that invalidates my weird position. Well, the problem is that Luther himself, several decades later, is really radically drawing back when we read his later writings and saying, we need to submit to authority. When you read his statements against the peasants' revolt, where he's talking about our need to submit at least to the secular authorities, to kings and princes, it does not sound at all the same as the way he addresses religious topics.
Nope.
And I think that, what's that?
Nope.
And I think that's because he recognized, because Luther was a smart man, I think he recognized that if we allowed his very principles to be applied to the secular arena, and if we allowed this separation of church and state that some people wanted, and anti-clericalism, then what we were going to get was a radical individualism where it's every man for himself. And to his credit, he wanted to prevent that. But I do think he got the ball rolling with his Trojan horse of the Reformation. And the problem is that now we're stuck with that whole identity. And to a certain extent, I think Erasmus was just as bad. I mean, when you read that, I was just reading a book that talks about the differences between Erasmus and Luther and how their rivalry with one another, in some sense, has actually shaped Western thought since then. And it was a very fascinating read. But one thing I noticed was that the fundamental issue that they agreed upon was this humanist individualism, where Erasmus believes that he has the authority to challenge the church's long-standing tradition of what a certain text of scripture is saying, by using grammar and
Ooh, a bad
these
boy.
things. And Erasmus was not above questioning what belonged in the canon, what belonged
Nope.
in this. Now, he never leaves the Catholic Church, but to a certain extent, that's just because the Catholic Church never came down on him like it did on Luther.
Yeah, he was able to stay in their good graces enough because he didn't like Luther. Like,
Right.
yeah, like because like Luther was just the bigger problem, which again makes me laugh. Like Luther realizes that his principles aren't good in the secular court, and like it's like, but they're okay in the ecclesial one. You know, like
Right.
if it's not beneficial there, and that is the big problem. And like I've read a bit of Luther in Calvin, and I have a very deep soft spot in my heart, for Anglicans. I have a whole shelf of them sitting back here.
Thank you.
You're welcome, of course. But I mean, I'm here, aren't I? But and I'm glad it's good that you admit, because it is true. And I'm not one of those like trad cat conspiracy theorists to be like the Reformation is the beginning of the Enlightenment, and but like it's kind of like throwing like this size of a snowball down a hill.
Right.
Once you hit the Enlightenment, it's like huge, and because I agree, like it starts the ball rolling. It starts,
Right.
and if I and my individual conscience can judge against literal millennia of church teaching on a certain subject, I mean, what can't I judge against?
Right.
We are literally at the point in human history where we are calling science bigoted. Like empiricism isn't good enough for us anymore.
Right.
It's just nothing that's a good standard for us anymore. And
Exactly.
and again, I
There is
can't
no
say I would
authority
actually
except
go
my
back and
feelings.
blame nominalism, like for the
Right.
like maybe even further back. I don't know. I'll blame Adam for eating the apple. Like, like
Right.
it's someone's
Well,
fault.
Richard M. Weaver blames Occam.
Yeah, I think he was probably right on that.
Yeah, I think he is. I mean, he makes a very good case for it that Occam and I mean Richard Weaver is a little bit weird because he doesn't like Thomas Aquinas, which is offensive to me, um but he makes a good point that when we get to Occam, there's a fundamental shift in how Occam views things that really radicalizes where Luther was coming from and takes it from, okay, if we don't have the church's authority and it's just me and my Bible, well, how do I understand the Bible? I understand the Bible through reason. So now we're going to be sola reason. I realize Occam never said sola reason. So if any Occamites are watching this right now, don't post a comment. Occam never said that. I know he never said that. But it sums up what he is doing. He's saying, now we're going to be sola reason. Now we're going to, follow after where our reason leads. And I realize Occam never abandons the faith, but much like Immanuel Kant never boldface says, I'm not a Christian anymore. But at the same time, I find it impossible to reconcile Immanuel Kant's view of God, his view of epistemology, with the Christian faith. I find it impossible to reconcile Occam's view of God with the Christian faith. And yes, he remains sort of, in name at least, he remains a Christian. And in certain things, I think I'm glad that we can claim Occam in the sense that it really shuts the mouth of a lot of science people who obsess about science and how we're all stupid for not being scientists. Well, the guy who invented modern science was a Christian. He was Occam.
Yeah,
But at the
Occam's
same
razor, man. Like we
right.
still talk about it.
Yeah, and Occam's razor is a decently good formulary, although I think it has some problems. But in a qualified way, I think it's very useful, especially when I'm dealing with conspiracy theorists. I love to pull out Occam's razor and just
Yeah.
chop up their thing. But here's the problem with Occam. He fundamentally shifts how we view authority. And he pushes that snowball he makes that snowball much bigger so that if Luther sets the snowball rolling, which I'm not even sure Luther does. I almost think that a lot of the ecclesiastical doctors who came before him were pushing the snowball already, because the way that they used scripture in their arguments, the sophists, was just the exact same way Luther does. The only difference is Luther figured out, in some ways ingeniously, hey, I can make an impregnable argument if I make it so that I'm sola scriptura and chuck out any books that disagree with me from scriptura.
Yeah, oh yeah, exactly. It's like, well, if I get to set the terms and I get to tell people, well, I don't accept your argument unless you can prove it to me here. It's like, okay, well, I don't accept any of your arguments that prove me wrong. Like, if those are the parameters, right, if you just get to set the debate parameters however you want, like, what good is anything? What good is authority? What good is truth? What good is any of that? And we're kind of standing at, I think, like the what's the right word for it? Like, we're standing at the there's a movie titled this. I can't think of it. Like, not this crap. I can't think of the word. But like, we are at like the full brunt of this now,
right,
where every single individual can set the parameters whatever they want, and which it's relativism, but there's a price, a
right,
very deep price, and it is the death of identity, both culturally and individually. If you want the freedom to do whatever you want, set whatever parameters you want for truth and for morality and blah 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 blah, price you got to pay. The piper still needs paid, as they say, and
right,
that is, you have absolutely no grounding for your identity or for your worth, because your nation doesn't matter, your ethnicity doesn't matter, none of it matters. I feel like I'm beating this drum too much, but I feel like, Flannery O'Connor had that great quote, like, for your readers that are deaf, you must shout. Like, or like, when they're blind, you must draw a big symbol. And that's why her writing was always like really grotesque and morbid.
right.
But like, I feel like I need to be shouting to the rooftops, like, this is the drug you've picked. Like, you have picked nihilism, and you're dealing with the consequences. Like, it's not that big of a mystery. Like, it's not that difficult to understand why everything sucks. Like, this is why, but no one is saying it.
Exactly. No, I think you really hit the nail on the head. And so with that said, I want to touch on our solution to this identity crisis. And maybe Western society has gone too far and there is no solution anymore, but I shudder to think that. So in true philosophical form, whether or not the solution will actually ever be put in place, I want to examine how we can really set up our society to return to an identity. And I think the first step is we need the unifying presence of the church again. We need to get rid of this idea that everybody can come to God their own way and that everybody's views of God are equally valid and we're all just blind men groping an elephant inappropriately. And we need to get rid of all that because it's dumb. The truth is, to go back to the elephant analogy, and what's his name? Randy Alcorn actually points out that the elephant analogy doesn't work because it doesn't take into account that what if the elephant spoke? What if the elephant revealed himself to these blind men? And the truth is, if the elephant just says at one point, you're touching my tusk, you're touching my tail, you're touching my leg, you idiots need to get it together, then all of a sudden these blind men aren't so blind anymore. They're not just groping an elephant. They're now able to see what's really going on. And that's exactly what we have. God has spoken. He has revealed himself to us in the person and work of Jesus Christ. God has come and become a man and made very clear who he is and what he is. And he's, through his apostles, given us the entirety of Scripture and the church to guide us into, as he says, all truth. We can know him. And so that's the first step. We need a unifying Christian identity. And I think Matthew and I will both agree that that identity needs to be orthodox. It needs to be Catholic. We can't just be whatever we want to be. We need
Me
to
and
be
my Bible
unified.
deciding
Right.
it.
Right, exactly. Because if it's just me and my Bible under the tree, then we're going to end up right back where we are now, because that's how we got here in the first place. Because eventually somebody says, I don't need the Bible either. All I need is me, myself, under this tree, flatulating whatever thoughts I want.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem. And so we need a unifying Christian identity. And I'm going to say my own somewhat radical, well, not somewhat, my own radical conclusion is that we also need a return in some sense to monarchy. We need to be underneath the authority of true structured government that is in submission to the church and that structures itself underneath the authority of a sovereign who can help to guide secular affairs while the church guides ecclesiastical ones. And and there's lots that we could talk about how that society would be run. Having studied this issue, I can say that the idea of universal health care, non-issue in a genuine society like that, because the church runs healthcare. It's not a burden on the government. You have church-run healthcare that actually cares for people, not insurance companies that bleed us dry and then refuse to pay out when we get sick.
Yep.
And you can tell I'm a little bit jaded about certain aspects of the society we live in. But my twofold approach is precisely that: a return to a unified ecclesiastical understanding and a submission of individualism to the greater whole. Not to say that you aren't an individual, we are all individual people, and ideally all of us will bow the knee to Christ individually. But we also represent cultural identities. We also represent national identities. There's lots of things that can unify us together so that we're not just me, myself, and I trying to be picked up by my bootstraps, which, as I believe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez so wisely pointed out, is literally physically impossible.
I'm glad that she could grace us with her wisdom to identify the absurdity in that sentence, which is actually the entire point of that statement. But
yes. So Matthew, I would love to hear. I just sort of gave my little Erasmian dialogue there, but
well, two things. The throne of Saint Peter waits for you, and then two, I'll try and be a bit less speaking in the Platonic ideal. Not that I disagree with you whatsoever. I think both those points are good. Just we're never going to see a monarchy in our day, and I'm going to be really simple. Use old things and surround yourself with them. In terms of recovering your identity, when I smoke, I have my Pabst Zippo lighter that he got when he worked for the mine, and it has his name engraved on it. I have my great uncle's lighter that he carried with him in Nam. Through the jungles of Nam, carried with him the entire time. They are. I don't have it hung up right now, but I have a British flag behind me that my brother-in-law brought me whenever he was in England, and because I'm part ethnically English, surround yourself with things that remind you that you are a person, which is a collection of 50 million different things, and don't just make them new things, make them old things, make them things that link you to your familial past.
Right.
I record this right now in my grandparents' house that I inherited and that I live in now. Like there's a connection to the
Mm,
past here. And I use things that are my grandparents. I have things that remind me of my ethnic background. I mean, I'm a trad cat, so I go to Latin mass and I pray the rosary in Latin. So I mean, like, I have
that's
a
what I'm talking about.
connection to my religious past because I'm while I'm English, I'm also Slovak and Hungarian, which are
Oh,
deeply Latin countries.
nice.
And so, like I remind myself of the same prayers that Thomas Aquinas prayed, and like all of these other things. So I'm connected to my religious past, and so do things that remind you of your past because much of your identity, again, not all of it, because we don't want to get too obsessive here, but much of your identity is wrapped up in your past. Like so much of what makes you you, you had absolutely no control over and came from before. So
Right.
take some time to like take inventory and stock of that and come to appreciate that more. And maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but like maybe if you do it and you take it for granted, help other people identify that
Right.
don't identify those things. Because like I had to learn all of this. I wasn't born this way. I was raised in a perfectly normal Novus Ordo Catholic home. Like I never left the faith. I left the faith in practice, but like I never left the faith in later. But like, I never cared that much. I never
Right.
cared that much of my ethnic background or anything like that. Um, that was my own choice, like when I came into college and identified these things and this was a solution. And I think this is more of an objective solution than it is like a relative one, like, oh, this just helped me. I think
Right.
everybody benefits from learning a bit more about their ethnic background, learning more about their family history, owning
Absolutely.
items that have sentimentality, like that. Those are all good, important things that help. The site term would be ground us. It helps ground us in our own reality. It helps ground us in like where we're at right now. And like I think that helps us put together our identity and figure out like who are we? What am I? Who was I? Where's my family come
Right.
from? Where do I stand? Like what's my religion mean to me? Like all that it's this big complex amalgamation of things. Like we're complicated organisms. We're not just single cell
Hmm.
to make it like a biological analogy. And so like use old things and have things around you that connect you to your past and to other people. I think that's one very small but kind of easy to implement start that will help people start recovering their identity in a multifaceted way.
Right. I totally agree. And I think, one thing that we can point to is I've talked to people who are really shocked when they find out that it was Irish Christian monks who actually preserved for us Plato and
Yep.
Aristotle, and who actually preserved for us Homer's Iliad, the Aeneid by Virgil. All of these things exist for us because of Irish Catholic monks. Now, if you think about that, that doesn't make sense to a lot of people because they say, well, why were Irish Catholic monks preserving pagan works? Well, the reason why is because of what you just said. We need to have a connection to our past that goes back further than our own existence, that goes back further than we need to be connected to the intellectual heritage that we belong to. And whether we like it or not, that includes Plato and Aristotle. I just finished reading a book called The Masters of Greek Thought that is about Socrates and then Plato and Aristotle, sort of by extension, since Socrates didn't write anything, so we only know about him through Plato and Aristotle. Um, so, but it's really about Socrates and Aristotle to the greater or lesser degree. But anyway, that's not really the point. The point is that my philosophical heritage is not just me sitting here thinking, it's understanding that there have been brilliant minds before me who I would have fundamental disagreements with, and yet they help to shape and form me. And until I interact with them, I cannot claim that I've come to a conclusion on
So,
my own, so to speak.
Father Gregory Klein, who he appears on Pints with Aquinas. I can't remember which episode this was. It was a couple episodes back. But he talks about, oh, what was this episode? It was on the tip of my tongue. He was on Dare We Hope, All Men to Be Saved. He was they were reviewing Henri de Lubac and Balthazar. He talks about how the idea of tradition is something being handed on and something we inherit. And he was saying, like, we live in a river and like we inherit the tradition that flows into us. And before we can critique it, we must receive it and make it our own. Then we can critique. You cannot stand outside of the river and critique the current. You have to get into the river, experience the current yourself, and then you can make comments about it or critique it. And he was talking about how people will like critique Thomas without ever having read him and stuff like that. Like, we all live in the West, be it Catholic, atheist, Protestant, whatever. We've been around long enough that we all have our own intellectual inheritors. Like, I have a good friend of mine, and I deeply respect him for it. He is a self-ascribed communist, but he's read Engels and Marx and all that and rejects them. And accepts the more new communist progressive thinkers. But he's taken the time to read Marx and go, no, I don't think that he takes culture seriously enough. And like all of these other things, and is like able to critique because he has looked at his, ideological heritage and read it, incorporated it, and then disagreed with it. And like, allow me to be a bit radical for a second. I would say most Protestants should have to do that. They should have to go back and read majority of Catholic literature and then be bold enough to go, nah, I don't like it. But until then, you cannot know where Luther, Calvin, or Cranmer were coming from.
I think they should have
no idea where they were coming from.
I think they should at the very least, frankly, have to read their own great
or at
thinkers.
least just go back to the start. Like, at least read the
Calvin,
Book of Concord. Read the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Read Calvin's Institute.
Right, exactly.
At least go back to your intellectual progenitors before you start like being like, oh, I'm a 4-point Calvinist. No, like, commit to being a 5-point and then deny it. But until you go back and genuinely try and like deal with where your thoughts come from, you don't really have any ground to say, I don't like this or I disagree with it. Like, no, you have to read them first and inherit what's been handed to you before you can start contributing to the next generation. Like, that's the whole idea, at least how I was taught it in high school. The distinguisher between a master's degree, a mastery of a subject, and then a doctor of a subject. Masters simply mean that you've read a lot and you have a great understanding of the subject as it's understood. A doctorate means that you have a great understanding of the subject at hand and you have contributed something new to it.
Yes.
Which is the whole idea of a dissertation and stuff like that. And so you have to, like, if we're going to be doing any of this, and again, not everyone is called to do this, nor does everyone have an interest in doing something like this. But if we all are going to take to our social media, insert whatever soapboxes and start to preach our various ideologies, we should at least take the time to understand the other people who hold our ideology in the past, what they've had to say, see if it makes more sense than what we're saying, or read it, come to an understanding of it, and then either just be humble and accept that, or with good enough reason go, no, I don't like that, and this is why I think this is better for my ideology.
Exactly. Well, that's one of the things that I really loved about Richard Weaver's ideas have consequences, is that to a certain degree, that's the whole point of at least the beginning of his work, is just to say, look, you don't have to agree with what I'm saying. You don't have to agree with your forefathers, but you need to at least look at what they were doing. Like your river analogy, until I've allowed that river to become a part of me, until I've imbibed it to a certain degree, I'm in no place to criticize it. I can't just stand outside of the river and say, that's wrong, with no real ability to do anything. In order to contribute, which I think that we should, if we're willing to put in the work, contribute, we need to first be willing to make it our own, like you said. And once we've made it our own, then we're actually in a position to contribute. And that's what a lot of people don't get, is that even Martin Luther, even the champion of sola scriptura, did not actually think that everybody had an equally valid opinion, and that just any, I realize that people are going to quote at me where he says, some random peasant with a Bible
is greater than any pope, blah, blah, blah,
greater than any pope. But what he's really getting at is not the way that people interpret that, which is therefore I'm better than any scholar who disagrees with me because I have my Bible and can say whatever I want. What Luther actually is getting at is something more like this, if we can put it into today's terms a little bit, and that is the authority shouldn't go away, but we need to, once we've imbibed this, we need to be able to challenge it and say, okay, is this tradition actually
valid,
biblical and valid, or is it just some thing that people made up? Now, I disagree with Luther.
You're only able to do that if you understand the history. Like,
exactly. You're only able to do that if you're actually looking at the tradition.
Yeah, Luther was only able to do his critiques because he was looking at going like, wait a second, these all seem like a lot of ecclesial abuses. The church didn't always seem to operate this way.
Right.
It wasn't like he suddenly decided this was a problem. He looked back and was like, I don't think this is a problem. This isn't to talk about his justification and stuff later on. I'm simply talking about his critique of abuses. He was able to do that just by looking at like, wait, the church didn't always operate this way.
The 95 Thesis is actually a Catholic document.
Yeah, no, if you read that, like, if you say you affirm the 95 Thesis, you're still basically just a Roman Catholic.
Right, exactly. You really are. You really are. You have not departed from the Roman Catholic faith yet if you affirm the 95 Thesis. In fact, if you affirm the 95 Thesis, I would argue that you actually affirm pretty much all of Catholic teaching. You merely are calling for a cessation of abuses, which, by the way, makes you more like Zechariah, calling the Jews to repent of their abuses. You're not calling for the abolition of the temple.
Yeah, exactly.
That comes later in the Babylonian captivity of the church. But,
yeah, no, exactly.
But here's the thing. Here's why I bring up Luther. That's not to agree with him. I actually disagree with a lot. I agree with actually almost all of his initial reforms in the 95 Thesis, but I disagree with what he says about everybody being able to sort of come to their conclusions based on their own conscience. I will put all my cards on the table right now and say that if I walk into my church and my conscience feels pricked by something my priest says, but I know that it's been a part of the church for 2,000 years, I sit there and do it. Like, I don't care that my conscience, because my conscience is not my authority. Well, that's just me. But, and that's not to say that I would do something that I truly believed was sinful, but it is to say that, for example, when I first started going to the church I go to now, I had a really hard time with the part of the liturgy where it says, and by the intercession of Mary and Peter and Paul and all your holy apostles. I had a really difficult time with that. But guess what? That's what priests like mine have been saying since day one. So I went with it. And now I don't have a problem with it anymore.
Well, I think this all goes back to kind of draw back to identity and pride. Like, I think that we have like like the sin of pride is probably one of our chief capital sins in the modern era.
Right.
And we don't want to do that. Like, we don't admit that the older people, like, again, like, these people built Notre Dame without any of our modern technology. Like, these people aren't dumb.
Without
Like, they aren't
math.
stupid, but we don't want to admit that. Like, we don't
Right.
want to admit that the ancients might have had something right, because we're the enlightened modernity. Like,
Right.
we have it all together now. And it's like, we have no
Which
reason
is why
to
we're
think
stupid enough to say this guy was ahead of his time. Like, what does that even mean? He was born earlier, but he was still smarter because he was more like us? That's dumb.
Yeah, no, it just doesn't make sense. And kind of like what you're saying, it's like obviously, like, your conscience is important stuff. It's like, but just because you don't like it doesn't mean you're right. Like, just
Right.
because it makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean that the truth itself is wrong or something like that. Like, you have to do the legwork. Like, if you are gonna start making these things, look into it, read about it, like, figure it out. Like,
Right.
it just, is it right or not? And so
Right.
I
So the reason
it just,
why the reason why I brought up Luther in truth is not to say that I agree with everything he said on that. What it is to say that even with what Luther was saying, he was not proposing. He's often called the first modern man. I think Luther would hate that.
oh yeah,
And here's
no doubt.
why. Here's why. Luther isn't proposing that we should all become our own authority. I think that's where it ends up. But he's not proposing that. What he's actually proposing is exactly what you just said. We need to expose ourselves to what's going on. We need to understand the tradition. And at that point, we have a right to decide whether or not we're going to agree or contribute to agreeing with it. He's not saying everybody has an equally valid opinion. He's saying once everybody has studied this, then they can formulate their own opinion. Now, I'll go one step further back and say that I even disagree with that a little bit and think that we need to submit to the opinions of authority much more than we do.
I would
But
say,
that
and just
aside,
because you're now free to do that doesn't make you right. It just means that
right,
you've done enough legwork to be wrong.
right,
I know it sounds kind of like
exactly.
weird, but
Exactly. You have done, and I would also venture to say, here's the other thing. I can respect someone who has studied out an issue and come to different conclusions than
yeah,
me.
yeah,
I cannot respect someone who says, "Well, I just don't like that, so it isn't true because I don't like it."
yeah.
Well, I have no respect for that. I have no respect for that kind of position. I do respect someone who has taken the time, understands the position they're rejecting, and can't bring themselves to affirm it. Fine. But actually do the legwork. And then once you do the legwork, to be perfectly frank, I think if most people did the legwork to understand the idea sets behind various things, then as Richard Weaver points out, I think if most people bothered to do that, they would see a lot of the advantages and a lot of the wisdom behind things that we've chucked
Yeah.
Unwisely. And at the very least, we might not have a society that looks exactly like those societies, and probably rightly so, because as you and I have both said, it's not like those societies were perfect. We're all fallen human beings. So I think things can improve, but we could at least improve the society we have. And most
It'd be much more
importantly,
unified, at
right,
least. There'd be at least a
exactly,
little less disagreements. Like
exactly,
we have some level of unity. I can't say
right,
it wouldn't be perfect, and I don't think we could ever, unless the church literally came back together, I don't think we could ever be as unified as Christendom. But I think we could get a little closer. I think
right,
we could go back a bit more to the way things were, in that we at least may have a common morality or something.
right,
Because we did more or less have a common morality even early 1900s, late 1800s,
right.
when the rural populace and stuff was still at least nominally Christian, and more or less had the same kind of social and moral understandings of things. Like, we got by then, like, it wouldn't be that bad to go back to then.
Right. And I'll say one more thing, and then we're probably at a point where we should wrap up. But I'll say one more thing,
Yeah,
that
probably.
is just to sort of be within the tradition of our forefathers, like Saint Francis, and that is, before we talk about reforming our entire society, the most important thing is we need to reform ourselves. We need to put this into practice before we say you need to examine every tradition that you're going back to. We need, and that you're refusing to. We need to do this ourselves and say, I'm going to examine my faith more closely. I'm going to be serious about my relationship with God. I'm going to be serious about studying why people throughout history have prayed this certain prayer this certain way. I'm going to examine this, and I'm going to let that reform and change me as a person. And then I can do the work of saying, if God calls me to it, I can do the work of saying, okay, let's talk about how we can apply this to society. So I don't think it's a good idea to have somebody who says, I'm a trad cat and I want to see a restoration of monarchy and all this, but they've never studied the life of Henry VIII. They've never studied the life of um, Edward the Confessor. That's just ridiculous. For that matter, they've never studied the life of my patron saint, Tsar Nikolai. If you've never studied Tsar Nikolai, don't call yourself a monarchist, because he's the boss. He's the monarchist martyr.
True.
Okay, so but the point being that
I have an icon of him on my bed. Yeah, no, I get it.
yes, yes. So the point of that being, as we examine these things, we become people who have something to contribute to the discussion, and God will call us to have that discussion when we become that person. But don't call society to make reforms you're not making in your own life. Actually do the legwork of making these reforms. And I'll go a step further and say, if you're not somebody who's studious, I'm not saying that you need to dedicate 7 hours a day to reading. What I am saying, though, is, maybe watch it. There are some great, well, maybe I'll be a little controversial here. There's a series available on Netflix called The Tudors, and it's actually very good. There are some parts you need to skip over. Okay, Henry VIII led a naughty life, but nevertheless,
Very.
yeah, he was a naughty boy. But my point being, you can expose yourself to a lot of things without becoming a scholar, and still enable yourself to become someone who can, even if you're a peasant like me, you can become someone more apt to discuss these things in an informed way. And you don't have to become a philosopher just to examine tradition, but you do have to put yourself in that position. So if you're just somebody who, if today you're somebody who just doesn't care, or has not cared about these things, and you find yourself interested by what we're saying, and you say, they're right, I need to know about things before I just decide that I'm going to create my own whole new worldview, I commend you. And I don't want you to feel like this is some daunting task that you need to study the entire corpus of Western thought tomorrow before you can state an opinion. What I am saying, though, is live the life of someone, live that trad life, come to an understanding of, okay, why do these ideas exist? What can I discover about this? What are some traditions I can imbibe? Like you were talking about having a lighter that my grandfather used, having a house that was passed down to me, not just selling it, but actually thinking about what this represents, actually thinking about the history behind these things, just starting there is a huge way to imbibe in us that spirit of hearkening back to our forefathers and what they had that maybe we don't have. So that is kind of our baby steps approach, maybe we could call it, to really reforming yourself so that you can reform society. So with that, be sure to share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed. And thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us and becoming a co-host. This is really helpful, and I think that
Always happy to be here.
I think with you here, we can actually do something of value, not just have me talking. Well, God bless you, brother. And God bless everybody watching.